In this video, we look at the role of Asia in driving globalization in the early modern period. So in this period following on from Columbus and the conquest of the Americas. And we're looking at arguments about the role of China in driving European adventurism in the Americas. And we're also looking at arguments about whether places in Asia acted to promote global networks or to try and shut them down. Again, we're looking at how the past gets turned into history. And here's the plan for thinking about the Americas and the metal that comes out of them in the broader global context. We need to recognize the significance of China because remember, the Silk Roads network was all about the good stuff coming out of China. Throughout the subject, I want us to keep an eye on China. It's a mass of people, it's a site of production, and it's significant in the global networks that emerge. Here we look at ideas about what the Manila Galleon trade means. We particularly pick up the ideas of André Günther Frank, and we question why it wasn't China or any other Asian power, but particularly China, that sent ships across the ocean to connect the old and new worlds. Here are those key questions again, and here's that list of further reading. But let's get into one particular piece of that further reading and look at the ideas of André Günther Frank. The title of his book, Reorient, is cute, and the ideas within it are really interesting. Frank's scholarly career was dedicated to promoting the significance of China within global networks, and he did it by looking at economic evidence. He argues that you can see where the wealth is, where the sophistication in societies lies, by looking at where the big cities are. Big cities generate money, but they also require the types of societies that can maintain them. There's a lot of work in maintaining a large city. And he makes the argument that in 1500, the big cities were not found in Europe. On the list of the 5 largest cities in the world, only Paris, is a European city. Instead, the leading cities are Istanbul, Beijing, Calicut, Cairo, Paris. So they lie in the Ottoman Empire, in China, in India, in North Africa, and only then in Europe. And Frank argues that this situation does not change much with the sudden emergence of American wealth into a global system. That while a European power might be in charge of the extraction of that wealth from the Americas, it doesn't end up back in Europe. Instead, the system whereby Asian centers are the important and wealthy ones is maintained because they're the ones that produce the good stuff. And he's good at catchy titles and he's good at catchy phrases. Europe used its American money to buy itself a ticket on the Asian train. It's hard to determine quite how big cities were in 1500. But Frank's observation holds true to the best of our knowledge. This is another set of figures. You can see it's slightly different ordering and slightly different figures from those presented by Frank, but it follows his general idea. Here, Constantinople lies quite a bit further down the list, but the big cities don't lie in Europe. Again, the largest European city is Paris, and it's quite low on the list. And that pattern holds. There are some problems, in my view, with these lists, and that is the complete absence of Mexico City. Mexico City, before the arrival of Cortez and the arrival of European diseases, was immense, sophisticated, and wealthy. But the cities of the New World don't feature on these lists. They feature in lists about later times, and those lists generally demonstrate the emergence of North America as an economic powerhouse. But that's a minor quibble. In terms of the old world, Frank was onto something, and he argues that Chinese dominance, or Asian dominance more generally, persists for a long time. The graph on the left shows how the 100 largest cities at any time period are distributed between the regions of the world. You can see that in 1800, the big cities are still in Asia. It's only in 1850 that Europe starts to challenge, and it's not until 1900 that there is more intense urbanization in Europe than there is in Asia. The graph on the right is another interesting one that shows the significance not just of Chinese cities, but of Indian cities, and the emergence of those North American centers in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's possible to disagree with Frank on the significance of large cities, but it's an interesting argument that he's making, and it's something that's worth thinking about. And Frank doesn't just make it in terms of urban populations and where the large urban centers are. He also makes it in terms of the flow of money. He tracks American silver. We've already seen it crossing the Pacific with the Manila Galleon, but he also looks at where the silver that initially crosses the Atlantic to Spain ends up. In a moment, I'll show you an interesting map summarizing his argument, but he drills down into the details in a way that's quite convincing. In particular, he notes that Europeans who go to trade in Asia can't sell European goods there. It's one of the things that various trading companies of various nationalities struggle with. There is no demand for European goods. They're not as good as the stuff that people in China already have access to, whereas the things that are in China are desirable to European consumers. And as a result, since they can't trade goods for goods, Europeans have to pay in money. They have to pay in precious metal because that is appealing to Chinese sellers. And between 1660 and 1720, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, has to pay in money or in precious metal for 87% of the things it buys. The Dutch government incentivizes using trading goods rather than exporting specie, but the Chinese sellers are not interested in European goods, whereas the European consumers are willing, when push comes to shove, to pay precious metal for those Chinese goods. But it is the VOC that trades in Asia. It's not Chinese merchants taking their wares to Europe. And that's something that we'll look into in just a moment, because there are interesting arguments about whether the world becomes connected or disconnected, and about whether places manage to pull themselves back from the global networks that were beginning to emerge in this period. One of the great examples of this, and one of the points of discussion, is Japan, which in 1635 shut its trade down. The shogun issued a closed country edict, which was very much aimed at cutting off contact between Japan and the outside world. But despite very strict restrictions on trade and on the presence of foreigners even in Japanese ports, let alone the ability of Japanese people to travel overseas, despite that very strict regulation of contact and of human movement, trade with Japan continues because it has desirable goods. And in the 1650s, despite shutting down all but one port to foreigners, it still receives 200 ships each year. And we'll come back in the subject to Japan and the closed country edicts, and how that Japanese isolation is breached. Ships come to Japan, ships come to China. They're not Japanese ships, they're not Chinese ships, but it's possible to argue that they're still serving Japanese interests, Chinese interests. And we'll look at that in a moment. But here's that summary map I promised you. And it will take a little bit of looking at. It's an odd projection, a really useful map projection in this context, but it's called the Nordic projection. You've got to work out where the continents are, how you're looking at the world, and then you can look at what it's showing you. And what it's showing you is the flow of American silver. You can see silver being produced, and then you can see it being used to buy things. And if you follow the arrows, you can see that proportion of American silver that goes direct across the Pacific to Manila and then into China. Some of it flows through Japan as well. You can see the much larger proportion which flows across the Atlantic to Europe, and then the onward movement of that from Europe to China. And you can see Frank making his argument about Europeans using American silver to buy themselves a ticket on the Asian train. His book, Reorient, is well worth reading. It's a good read. It's a gripping read. It's an interesting argument. And I think this map is well worth looking at and remembering. Now, Franck is interested in flows of silver and in urban populations and in making economic arguments about the dominance of Asia, but particularly of China, in this period after the discovery of the Americas, all the way through to the 19th century. There's other evidence that hints at the same underlying trend. Christianity arrived in Japan and in China at about the same time that it arrived in the Americas, but there are very different outcomes in Japan and in China than there were in the Americas. There was certainly no conversion within a generation. The images here are interesting. If you look at the missionaries who carried Christianity to Japan, to China, they've had to adjust themselves to their circumstances. Might be hard for us to pick up because we're not used to looking at the clothing at the time. But Matteo Ricci is wearing the robes of a mandarin. He's had to become acceptable to Chinese society and learn how to present himself in a way that's appealing to Chinese aristocrats. Similarly, Francois Xavier had to present the Christian message in a way that was acceptable to Japanese people, and neither of these men had huge success. They were respected, they're remembered fondly by the church, but it's not conversion in a generation. And if you look at the population of Christians amongst the general population of these places, they're pretty small. After a century, there were 300,000 Chinese Christians, which is a fair number, except that they're lost in a population of 100 million. And after 1721, Christian missions are banned in China in any case, because while Matteo Ricci was accepting of Chinese ideas, particularly about the significance of ancestors, and managed to find an accommodation with Christian beliefs, when the Catholic Church became more militant about rejecting ideas from non-Christian sources, tolerance on the Chinese side failed as well. In Japan, closed country edicts include injunctions against Christianity, and the religion was effectively stamped out in very cruel ways. People were forced to convert or die, and many of the missionaries themselves converted to Buddhism because it seemed a better alternative than crucifixion. While this might seem a digression, consider it in contrast to the Americas. The world was changing, the New World had sprung into existence, and was a source of massive wealth, apparently controlled by Europeans. But in China and Japan, worldviews are not shaken, and we can see this because there's no room for Christianity to move in and explain the otherwise inexplicable. Life in China and Japan is continuing in much the same pattern as before, but with more available silver, rather than the case in the Americas, where the world is falling apart. I promised to return to the idea that Europeans were doing the difficult work of transporting goods to meet Asian demands. Columbus was the first voyager to effectively connect old and new worlds, and I presented that as a case of Europe being a boil that was lanced through the fall of Constantinople and that exploded across the Atlantic in its desperate attempts to reach the source of the good stuff. Looking at what happens with China and Chinese voyaging tends to reinforce that view. China had had voyages of discovery. It had a significant Admiral Cheng Ho Zheng He. Again, his name was not written in our alphabet, and it's possible to pronounce and spell it in a variety of ways. He sprung into focus in world history a couple of decades ago, and there is some rubbish written about what he did, promoting the idea that he travelled much more widely than he did. What he did, what can be traced in clear and irrefutable evidence, was quite enough. He undertook voyages around the Asian and African coasts, You can see in that bottom map an indication of the places he reached on his 7 voyages. It's only an indication. There are various maps produced. There are some other places that can be added as locales where his ships communicated with the shore and with the local people. But it's not necessary to know those details. It's necessary to be aware of how far his ships went, how awesome his fleet was. The model above shows Columbus's ship, the small one, in contrast to one of the vessels of Zheng He's fleet. It may not be entirely accurate. It's not my area of specialization, and I can't tell you. I can tell you that it is accepted among historians that Zheng He's ships were much larger than Columbus's and carried many more men and were more numerous. They undertook diplomatic voyages and suppression of piracy in these regions that were of importance to China. So it's not that China lacked the ocean-going technology to take to oceans and to travel significant distances, but Chinese politics shuts down the voyaging that is occurring. Japan shuts itself off for political reasons. China shuts itself off for political reasons. There's trouble within the Chinese court. Zheng He is a Muslim who falls out of favor with the rise of Confucianists within the court. There are timber shortages and there's trouble too along the northern boundary. As a result, it's Chinese policy to withdraw resources from this type of voyaging and to concentrate on strengthening the country and on strengthening the boundaries with the north. And as with Japan, it's interesting to keep an eye on what this does to global trade and to China's involvement in global trade. And the short answer is China might not reach out to the world, but the world cannot keep away from China. There may be Chinese restrictions placed on trade, placed on contact with foreigners, but foreigners will come to Chinese ports and observe those restrictions and pay silver for the privilege. What this means is that with the Manila Galleon, we do get a system that reaches around the world, but it tends to reach around the world in both directions, back to China. Perhaps Franck overstates his case, but it's a compelling one, and it's well worth considering where in this period the good stuff comes from and how the desire for good stuff can affect circumstances in widely removed places. Franck is an important figure in thinking about global networks. I've given an outline of his ideas and of some of the evidence that he draws together. He is well worth reading if this is of interest to you. There are other views of where the power lies in global networks and in communication between cultures. With the collision of the old and new worlds, things changed. The distribution of species around the world certainly changed. But remember how quickly syphilis spread from the New World through Europe all the way across to Canton. It might be Europe that crossed the Atlantic and connected up the old and new worlds, but China still has a significant place in the systems that emerge.